In October of 1971, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, King of Kings, Light of the Aryans, staged a celebration of 2,500 continuous years of Persian monarchy in the ancient city of Persepolis. Royalty, presidents, and prime ministers from around the world honored the glorious past and bright future of the imperial state of Iran. On the 16th of January 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, King of Kings, Light of the Aryans, boarded a plane at Marbad International Airport in Tehran and left Iran, never to return. The workers, peasants, and oppressed people of Iran destroyed the Shah's great civilization and took power into their own hands. The rise and fall of the Iranian Revolution is more than just history. It is a demonstration of what is possible, of how we can free ourselves, and also of how that freedom can be taken away. A new generation has gone to struggle in the workplaces and streets of Iran. Learning the lessons of the Iranian Revolution is important for them and is important for us. The celebration of Persepolis was designed to portray, for both domestic and foreign audiences, an image of Iran as a land of stability and continuity, of a regime taking a nation from a glorious past to an even more glorious future. This image bore little resemblance to the actual experience of Iran in the 20th century. Iran entered the century as a regional power in decline. Its territory, natural resources, and independence were under continuous threat from Britain and Russia. In 1906, Iran's international debt was 3 times its annual revenue, and its customs service was under foreign administration. The inability of the government to defend national sovereignty and manage the state and economy unleashed revolution. An alliance of dissatisfied traditional elites and modernizers forced the regime to hold elections and grant a constitution. The next 15 years saw the fall of the ruling dynasty and prolonged unrest in a period where no party or social force was strong enough to hold power. This period of instability and the shattering of the international order by the First World War brought new social forces into the fight, including a short-lived Persian Soviet Socialist Republic in the north of the country. But a new dynasty emerged from the decade and a half of unrest. A new modern army and its architect, Reza Khan, won the support or acquiescence of traditional elites, conservative monarchists, and British imperialism as the only force that could restore order. In 1925, Reza Khan became Reza Shah. In 1941, the British and the Soviets removed Reza Shah from his throne because he was seen as pro-German and replaced him with his 20-year-old son, Mohammad Reza. For the years of the war, Mohammad Reza Shah was effectively a puppet ruler. The north of the country is occupied by the Soviet Union, the south by the Americans and the British, to ensure control of oil and transit routes to the Soviet Union. While Iran regained some of its independence following the war, its economy, dependent on oil, was still effectively owned by the British. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which found the first oil in 1908 in Iran, had an agreement with the Iranian government to split the profits. Iran got 12%, the company got 82%. A series of cosmetically different but fundamentally similar agreements followed. After World War II, increased nationalism and awareness that other nations were getting better deals led to a movement for nationalization of oil and the election of the National Front government of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1951. After Britain, with the support of the US, refused to make major concessions, the government nationalized the oil industry. This was followed in 1953 by a military coup supported by the US and Britain, which led to the Shah assuming absolute power. Determined to modernize the country, marginalize the traditional elites, and consolidate his power, the Shah launched what he called the White Revolution in 1963, which meant limited land reform, huge investment in all levels of education, state-owned and supported industry, and most important of all, massive repression of military spending. However, the great society the Shah looked to produce was hobbled from the start. Peasants were displaced by land reform, and craft workers were displaced by industry, forming a new volatile and anti-regime social layer in the new slums of the major cities. Workers in the new industries faced low wages and dangerous conditions, yet were aware of the huge profits they generated for the owners. The traditional middle class saw their status and economic position eroded by modernization. The new middle class and technicians and managers were disgusted by the brutality, corruption, and inefficiency of the government. In almost 4 decades of rule, the Shah managed to build the ranks of his enemies and reduce the base of his support to the military, the bureaucracy, and the tops of the new business elite. In January of 1978, demonstrations broke out against government attacks on the exiled religious leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who quickly became a rallying point for the resistance to the regime. Bourgeois and left opposition groups thought they could use him and then push him aside, and were afraid to challenge his leadership because they believed the masses were too backward to accept their real ideologies and real objectives. The first demonstrations were broken up and dozens were killed by the police. Waves of demonstrations then took place in alignment with the traditional 40-day period of mourning. The Shah vacillated between offering reforms such as fully democratic elections and escalating repression that brought the army onto the streets. Neither policy was successful in ending the protests. In early September, the bloodiest clashes yet took place and martial law was declared. At the same time, oil and government workers went on strike, leading to a general strike in October, which made clear to both the opposition and the government that a turning point had been reached. The bourgeois opposition made a formal alliance with Khomeini, and the Shah formed a military government. So the established sides were now very clear. After slowdown in activity, December saw the death blows struck against the regime. The security forces lost control of the streets, and strikes completely paralyzed the economy. After naming a moderate oppositionist as the prime minister in January 1979, the Shah fled the country on what was advertised as an extended vacation, which turned out to be very extended indeed. At the beginning of February, the Ayatollah Khomeini returned from France and declared a provisional revolutionary government. Rebellions took place in the military with the support of left forces, and the Shah's government collapsed for good. Workers' councils known as shuras and neighborhood revolutionary committees were formed as organs of popular power. Workers took control of industry, and students took control of the schools and universities. Simultaneously, a multi-sided struggle for power began, and the shuras, the schools, and the streets, while the oppressed nations rejected the central government. In discussions of what's happened in the past and what's happening now in Iran, one of the factors that's often left out is the oppressed nations. Over a third of the population of Iran are members of these nations, which are geographically concentrated in the border areas. Their people are discriminated against on linguistic, religious, and national grounds. These peoples have played a key role in opposition to the central state, both under traditional leaders and under more radical revolutionary opposition groups. In fact, in the aftermath of World War II, independent states were briefly formed in both Kurdistan and Azerbaijan with Soviet support that lasted for about a year. However, the movements of the oppressed nations have always had difficult relations with the national left organizations, primarily due to these organizations' failure to recognize and support the full right of self-determination and sometimes outright Persian chauvinism. The main left groups that were present as the revolution got off the ground were three. The Tudeh Party, which was the official Communist Party, had wide support, especially among intellectuals, but it never faltered in its commitment to tailing bourgeois left groups and serving the foreign policy goals of the Soviet Union. Then there was the People's Mujahideen, which was founded in 1965. which had an ideology that initially aimed to find a middle ground between Islamic nationalism and Marxism, and had social basis among the petty bourgeoisie, and particularly in high schools and universities. This organization split in 1973 between a majority that emphasized Islamic struggle and a minority that saw themselves as Marxist-Leninists, who formed a group called PACAR, the Organization of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. Both these groups were, despite rhetorical commitment to mass struggle in the working class, were primarily oriented towards street action and urban guerrilla attacks. The third group, the Fedayeen, was formed in 1971 by radicalized young members of the moderate nationalist opposition. It also had an orientation toward guerrilla warfare, and at the height of the revolution split between a pro-Tudeh majority and a minority committed to its original politics. Of course, the key factor behind all of this, that again is rarely discussed in the media, is the working class. And the working class was the force that gave the decisive blow that killed off the Shah's regime. The movement in the streets was powerful. It destroyed the illusion that the regime had any legitimacy. It pushed the regime into crisis, but could not by itself deliver a death blow. The regime was willing to shoot down protesters by the hundreds, and did. As long as they had weapons, ammunition, and men willing to use them, there was a stalemate. But in the first 3 weeks of October 1978, oil, steel, and rail workers went on strike. Other sectors followed, and the economy and the state began to shut down. When oil production stopped completely in November, the police and military began to run through their reserves. This ultimately resulted in the ridiculous spectacle of the Carter administration sending several tankers of refined oil products to one of the world's largest oil producers so that the military would be able to run their vehicles. These tankers sat in port because no workers were willing to unload them. In the absence of unions, with minimal involvement from the organized left, workers formed strike committees and then councils, or shuras, that took control of production. Alongside the shuras, revolutionary committees were formed in neighborhoods and towns as local government collapsed. The grassroots spontaneity of these bodies gave them both strengths and weaknesses. Rooted directly into workplaces, the shuras had no bureaucracy to moderate or distort the will of the rank and file. They were seen by workers as a direct representation of their power. But the absence of a workers' party rooted in the workplaces, the absence of previous experience of mass struggle, and the absence of industrial and geographical coordinating bodies meant that after the initial strike waves, individual workplaces were isolated. The Iranian workers destroyed the old state but were unable to build their own. Instead, despite heroic resistance, they were unable to stop the consolidation of a new state that, behind the rhetoric of revolution, was built on their backs and on their graves. The provisional revolutionary government appointed by Khomeini was divided from the start and unable to impose its authority on the country. The former bourgeois opposition was in office but not in power. This became clear when their draft constitution was rejected by the Islamists, and a committee of clergy was set up to draft a replacement. The moderates lost influence, and the supporters of Khomeini formed the Islamic Republican Party. The IRP fought on two fronts. In the streets, the revolutionary committees and the shuras, they sought to eliminate all opposition by force if necessary. In the formal politics of government, they used the proposed new constitution and the idea of an Islamic Republic to seize the initiative. They were aided in this by the largest left organizations. The Mujahideen avoided taking a position either for or against the Islamic Republic, and the Tudeh, the official Communist Party, actively campaigned for the constitution proposed and for the new Islamic Republic. Confrontation with the United States, whose embassy was taken over by supporters of Khomeini in October of 1979, and Iraq, which thought it could easily carve up a weakened Iran and invade it in September 1980, was invaluable in helping the new regime consolidate its power. Support for the new government against its foreign enemies was identified with patriotism and anti-imperialism. Any threat to national unity was deemed reactionary. Taking advantage of these circumstances, the new regime, its security forces, and its street fighters eliminated the opposition one organization at a time. After moderate nationalists came the turn of the Mujahideen. The rest of the left then was eliminated one at a time until only the Tudeh party, the official communists, which supported the crackdown on every single other organization and even informed on these organizations and helped the state smash them, was left standing. Then came the turn of the Tudeh party, and their leaders took the place that everyone else had on TV, pledging allegiance to the line of the Imam Khomeini and denouncing secularism and communism. And the entire left was either dead, in prison, underground, or in exile. And yet the counter-revolution, for all of its brutality, for all of the thousands killed, faced limits. It still needed to position itself as the heir to the revolution. It still needed some kind of legitimacy. That's why they proclaimed an Islamic Republic rather than what Khomeini's writings originally called for, an Islamic State, directly and exclusively ruled by the clergy. This new administration faced a decades-long struggle to close down political space and impose neoliberalism. Even decades later, Iran had more political freedom and a greater social safety net than virtually any other nation in the Middle East. And that was the living legacy of the revolution. That and the fact that the revolution is a living memory for both the population of the country and the people running the state. And I'm just going to conclude, happily this didn't take as long as I thought it would, with 2 points on why the Iranian Revolution matters, why it's something we need to talk about and understand. The first is why it matters for people of Iran, who now are out in the streets and striking in their workplaces once again. The slogan has been raised all over the country: death to the dictator, be it Shah or Ayatollah. People in Iran have made this connection that they don't want a capitalist state. They don't want to stay of the oppressors, whether it's a monarchy or an Islamic Republic. They want freedom. That, and hopefully having learned some of the lessons of the failures of the previous revolution, the slogan is raised again and again: woman, life, and freedom, which is a slogan of the oppressed Kurdish nationality, of the Kurdish revolution. And that's something that's echoing throughout the streets of all of Iran. And why it matters for the world and for us is that it shows even the most brutal regime has limits. Even the most brutal regime, when faced with people willing to put their lives on the line and with the social and economic power of the working class, can be destroyed. And that lesson is important for us, not just in our extending solidarity to the people of Iran, but also here and now, in the streets and the workplaces of our own country. Because hopefully our time will come too, when we take up the struggle against our own rulers and see that with organization and with theory and with heroism, we can destroy them in the same way the Shah and his regime were destroyed.